Welcome everybody to the first show of the day at the Net Zero Nuclear Green Zone Pavilion right here in the Energy Transition Hub in Expo City, Dubai. We're about halfway through COP as of today. The rest day's tomorrow, and it's already been a controversial and, in my opinion, extremely exciting COP28. I am Mark Nelson. I am a managing director of Radian Energy Group, a clean energy consultancy based in Chicago, Illinois. And I have a very interesting panel. I'm not sure something like this has quite come up in a COP before, and when we get into the details, I hope you're as shocked as I am that we haven't had this particular topic before. So I've got two interesting guests for us today, and about 30 minutes to squeeze the most interesting story that you may not have heard in the world of clean energy that's unfolding in front of, not in front of our eyes, but in oceans around the world. This is going to be a panel on decarbonization of shipping through nuclear energy. We've got Tony Huston here from Core Power, in my opinion, the world's leading effort to decarbonize shipping. And we also have Kirsty Gogan of TerraPraxis, a clean energy consultancy, Lucid Catalyst CEO and managing director as far as I know, yes? Still at Lucid Catalyst, a leading clean energy consultancy, and also founder and still co-CEO of TerraPraxis, one of the world's leading clean energy NGOs. So I want to say this about Kirsty. Whenever there's about to be a giant wake-up call to the whole world, when the giant consultancies start putting out their glossy reports and the media starts picking up on stories as if it's the first time, you can guess that Kirsty and her team were behind a major part of it maybe 2, maybe 3 years right before. So whenever you're trying to see where things are going, you can look at the recent archive of reports on the TerraPraxis website, and you can see where things are about to be. So I think one of the themes in this pavilion is this one truly. This net zero nuclear pavilion, we take energy extremely seriously, and in my opinion, regrettably, that has not always been the case at COP. There's been a bunch of people talking about climate change, assuming that energy just kind of works itself out in the details, when I think at this pavilion we all agree it's a main story. Shipping. Whenever you see a news story that says, isn't it crazy? We have strawberries here in the winter from far away. Or we have flowers here from far away. They're flown in by an airplane. What you find out when you dig into the details is that's actually really efficient, as crazy as it sounds, to grow something in the right climate and then ship it by air. But that has almost no relation to the pure cleanness of shipping things by boat. The problem is shipping things by boat runs almost the entire world economy, as we're about to hear, so the effects are magnificent, good and bad, when you do anything with shipping. So I'm not a shipping expert, but I know a little bit about nuclear, and I'm really excited to see if we can figure out the trends that we're about to see from the naval world. So, Tony, tell me something really quick. You're a lifelong nuclear guy, right?
I'm actually not. I'm neither nuclear nor maritime, but I was put in a position to merge the two industries from a financial perspective. That's been my goal. My goal is to look for these great global dislocation trades and these great convergence trades of one industry or one technology not seeing the opportunity with the other, right? So this is really one of the largest I've ever seen, which is shipping is in a transitionary state, much like it was in the 1830s. It's looking for a new fuel source.
So shipping in the 1830s, looking for a new fuel source.
Coal.
What did they go
Coal.
from
sail to coal.
Okay.
So this has happened before. So the shipping industry today is, from global trade finance and everything else, is a $19 trillion a year industry. It ships about 80 to 90% of the world's goods. We all know these massive container ships carry things across the ocean. So we're looking at a $19 trillion a year industry that consumes about 350 million metric tons of high carbon fuel every year. And that's unabated, it's offshore, it's heavy carbon, it just goes into the environment. So it's a terrible environmental disaster, but it's very cheap. So in order to dislocate that diesel engine, which has been around for 140, 50 years, we need to find something new, right? So the IMO and our own internal pressures to change for a more efficient propulsion system leads us to nuclear.
And IMO is
the International Maritime Organization under the United Nations.
And do they have a lot of sway over
shipping? They have
shipping?
clout. They have a lot of clout. I mean, it's hard to have sway over shipping because it's all over the world. It goes into different ports. It's hard to control and contain the shipping industry. So our opinion is we need to lead it by profit. You have to lead by profit and not by taxation and behavioral change of that magnitude.
So can you
it's got to be more profitable.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you describe what fuel is actually used predominantly today in these ships?
There are several different kinds of. There are many different kinds of fuels, but the primary fuel is bunker fuel, which is about bunker fuel, which is a sort of a residue product from the global petrochemical industry. It's a gelatinous type of 85% carbon material that's burned offshore.
So
it's
gelatinous.
Terrible.
Black ooze called
that's right.
bunker oil or bunker fuel.
You scrape it off the bottom of
and put into the ships and then burn offshore.
So when you see the ships near shore, they burn clean fuel, but offshore they burn the black fuel. It's very bad.
Okay, so I heard about
So that 350 million metric tons of burned fuel per year translates into a gigaton of emissions per year.
That's like some of the largest countries in the world.
It's between Japan and Germany. That's what the shipping industry represents in terms of its offtake per year.
And it's not just the CO2 you're talking about.
It's everything. It's sulfur, it's nitrous, it's nitrate, it's everything.
Because it's the nasty stuff they can't burn.
It's all the bad stuff.
And how big are these ships?
300 meters or so. I mean, there are 100,000 ships over 100,000 deadweight ton. So they're large vessels. I mean, they're football fields long or two.
So like the interior of this...
this pavilion.
This pavilion. So we've got over 1,000 ships the size of this pavilion going all the time, burning a black gelatinous ooze.
Yes, that's right.
So what's your proposal?
Welcome to shipping. Welcome to the shipping industry. The proposal basically is to, since McCall founded the company, McCall, the founder, has been looking for alternative fuel sources and alternative propulsion systems for smarter, faster, greener, cleaner structures.
Faster.
For years. Faster is important. Faster
Could you tell
and
us
cheaper.
a little bit about this? Faster?
Yeah, so a nuclear vessel, nuclear vessels are old. The United States Navy has been maintaining them since the 1950s in an exceedingly professional and safe way. So for 70 years, we've had nuclear vessels all over the world. We've never had an accident in the Navy, never happened. So, and they don't refuel. They can go for years. They can go for between say 10 and 30 years without refueling. Because of the fuel load.
Vessels the size of these giant ships.
So aircraft carriers. Our United States aircraft carriers and submarine fleet, the 72 vessels that comprise that setup, don't have to be refueled for between 10 to 30 years.
So on one hand, we have this black
and they can make their own fuel. They can make their own synthetic jet fuel.
Okay, now that's even further. So black gelatinous ooze, loaded in every trip, burned offshore. All the emissions go, and it's like a smog over their path. Versus ships which are for commercial purposes now, but have run for 50, 60 years?
70 years.
70 years, and they don't refuel until about 10 to 30 years after they depart.
And they're brought back to one specific station, and they're decommissioned at that point. So modern nuclear, the ones we're looking at, of course, there have been advances in different types of nuclear. They're different kinds. The ones we're prototyping now, or we're looking to prototype soon, is a molten chloride reactor, the fast reactor, which is a molten salt in a specific contained vessel that is non-pressurized. So it's insurable, it doesn't have these sort of expulsion danger that other nuclear situations do. It's much more appropriate for marine environment, so we're very happy with that. So we're prototyping that with the Southern Company and TerraPower, who are our main partners in this, with the Department of Energy along the way.
Southern Company, for those of us not American, is that an experienced nuclear?
It's a very large utility in the United States who's a nuclear operator, who is an excellent partner in this sort of thing.
So when you said convergence industries at first, I hadn't heard that term. You're saying you've got expert developers of nuclear reactors,
yes,
expert operators and builders of nuclear reactors,
and commercialized people who want the commercial value out of this to really create a whole new industry.
And the expert shipping, and you're merging these.
That's right. Stitching it together. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Tony. We'll come back to you in a moment.
That's on that one? Okay.
That's awesome.
Okay.
Yeah. Look at this crowd you've assembled here.
Yeah.
Kirsty, so when did you get involved in shipping?
Yes, so, thanks for the introduction. And you know what? We have been working on this for quite a few years, and we do have a couple of reports on our website that I recommend you look at. One is called The Missing Link to a Livable Climate. And the reason that we started really looking at shipyard manufactured nuclear power plants for the production of power, you can have offshore power plants powering offshore operations or close to shore operations. You could sail up a floating nuclear power plant that's made in a shipyard next to an existing coal plant, for example, and then supply emissions-free power or heat and steam to that existing coal plant and stop burning coal. But the reason why shipyards are super interesting is because they're amongst the highest productivity manufacturing environments in the world.
And
and we care
has
about
that always been that way, all the way back to the coal and the sail era?
I mean, not all of them are. There's about 280 shipyards operating in the world today, and there's a handful of really world-class shipyards that are making, incredibly large offshore facilities.
Very big machines.
Like we're talking like Tony was saying, like 400 meters long, like almost half a kilometer long, and these are giant, complex, processing facilities that are commissioned by the oil and gas industry. And the oil and gas industry has recently figured out the benefits of serialization and standardization, and that means that essentially you design a big complicated thing, you figure out how to build it, you manufacture it in a very high productivity factory, like a world-class shipyard, and you deliver it. And right now, some of these oil and gas companies are commissioning, one of these per year, so they're starting to be churned out. So that's the first reason, and that's really the first opportunity for the marine sector to contribute towards our global clean energy transition requirements, which is adding an incredibly powerful, highly capable supply chain.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to say historically in the United States during the Second World War, we cranked out 2 Liberty ships per day.
Ships.
Per day.
Ships.
Old supply ships, supply chain ships. And now the Koreans are making 2 a week.
Right. And so is the rate of deployment that we need achievable? So there's 60,000 ships operating around the world today. As you said in your introduction, keeping the whole global economy moving. That's how the global economy really functions, through moving things around in these gigantic ships that are very energy intensive. If we wanted to replace the 100 million barrels of oil per day that we currently use globally in all of the operations, so that's how much oil we use, ladies and gentlemen, 100 million barrels of oil per day that we currently consume globally. The global energy infrastructure is big. Okay, and one of the gaps in the discussions, I think, around the energy transition is that we're not really fully accounting for the scale of our existing global energy infrastructure that we have to decarbonize, and then also, by the way, designing to massively expand it, maybe even double or triple it to meet rising global energy demand. If we wanted to replace the 100 million barrels of oil per day that we currently consume with emissions-free carbon-neutral fuels that would be manufactured using, for example, power from nuclear to make hydrogen and then converting the hydrogen into synthetic fuels that we could move around, you'd need about 14,000 fuels production platforms made in global shipyards. And that sounds like a lot, but it doesn't sound like so many when you think about, put them into the context that there's 60,000 ships already out there.
So it's one thing, Kirsty, to be TerraPraxis, see the future, be ahead of the curve. This can't go anywhere, right? If the shipyards that you say are so productive that they're not interested. Have you gotten any interest from shipyards anywhere in the world in nuclear energy?
Yeah, so when we started talking about this a few years ago, and we were commissioned to produce a report by the Electric Power Research Institute, which has now become their most downloaded report. And they're very proud of it. There's videos made about it and so on. It's a fantastic report which really sort of does some techno-economic analysis looking at the feasibility of making these shipyard manufactured fuels production platforms. My old government colleagues in the UK, they used to make fun of me like I was some kind of James Bond villain because I wanted to put floating nuclear power plants all over the world. And now it's incredible what's happened this year in the way that the tide has turned, excuse the pun, since the International Maritime Organization finally got around to setting net zero targets in July this year. And not only have they set net zero targets for 2050, but they've set interim targets starting in 2030 for the global shipping industry to really demonstrate and show evidence that it is decarbonizing. And so the conversation in that sector has changed from campaigning for targets to how are we going to meet them. And as a result of that, in the last 6 months, we've had an unbelievable amount of incoming inquiries from the global shipping industry. And I'm talking about everything from cruise ships to container ships to FPSO manufacturers, the whole range, offshore oil drilling, companies, gigantic amount of interest. And there's three key ways in which they're interested in nuclear energy. The first is in fuels production. They understand that it's not going to be possible to make the alternative fuels that they need at the scale that they need, in the time scales that they need, and at the costs that they need using renewables. And let me just explain that just for one moment. So let's say that ADNOC, here we are in the UAE, let's say that ADNOC, which has a target, by the way, of increasing its oil production from 3 million barrels per day, about 3% of global oil production, to 5 million barrels per day by 2030. So there's a little bit of a conflict there with their decarbonization goals, but okay. Increasing that to 5 million barrels per day. If they wanted to produce an energy equivalent to that 5 million barrels of oil per day from synthetic fuels, hydrogen-based fuels using solar as the main primary power source, that would require about 20,000 square kilometers and 2,000 gigawatts of PV. Okay, now the UAE is big and sunny, but that would actually be like a very substantial amount of land, even in a country like this that's very big and sunny. If you wanted to produce the same amount of energy, same amount of alternative fuels with nuclear, you'd need only 100 gigawatts, firstly, of nuclear, because it's, guess what, a lot more efficient and higher capacity factors, and you produce power and heat, which means you get a higher volume of hydrogen production and more efficiency, and that would be about 20 square kilometers.
Now, you just said a bunch of really helpful rules of thumb that I think I'll be able to walk away with. I'm in nuclear. I happen to know that America has about 100 gigawatts of power plants. For those of you in the audience, 1 gigawatt is about 1 million people's worth of power. So we have a bit, since Kirsty and her team have done the mathematics for us, we have an interesting situation here, where the same amount of nuclear power as currently comes in the US is what you need with conversion to make fuel to power the world's ships plus a bit more, or the same amount as today.
So with 100 gigawatts, which is equivalent to about the US fleet, you could produce about 5% of total global oil consumption, energy equivalent.
Which is about the shipping today.
Right, yeah. So you could decarbonize shipping. So that's one way. They're like, oh, we understand that we're going to need to source our alternative fuels in future using nuclear supply chains. And they understand, interestingly, that there's going to be a lot of competition for those alternative fuels. And so they're really interested in having some kind of early control in the procurement and in the development of those supply chains in order to secure their business critical fuels in future. And these shipping companies tend to be quite long term in their thinking, so they're a very interesting kind of community actually to engage with. And the two other ways, just briefly.
Could we ask, since most of us have not done this engagement, what is long term in shipping? A year, 5 years?
It's generational.
It's generational. So like the length of refueling of aircraft carriers, like 20, 30 years.
These are family businesses.
Right. How many families are we
Generations
talking
of
3 or 4.
Yeah, and they're looking ahead and they're intending to be around for another 100 years.
So as an example, you asked about shipyards or shipyards involved. So 3 of our main investors are Japanese shipyard owners in Japan.
And they're multi.
There are our investors. Yeah. Oh, they're from the 1880s and the 1890s, and the other industrial backers from Japan are companies from the 1850s. So they are always thinking long term. They're always preparing long term. Japan was an obvious place for us to go for investors and for just shipping structures.
Yeah. And they're also often privately owned. And that means that it's possible for these companies to make investment decisions very decisively, very quickly, very decisively, because they don't tend to have, a lot of shareholders and, other investors that can limit decision making.
They don't have those kinds of rules, right? So they don't have a board to report to in terms of conflict. Many of the families are very keen to pass. So one of our investors literally said to us, he's doing this because he wants his daughters to have a cleaner world. This is part of the reason why he's investing in Core Power.
Okay, so this is what I'm feeling. The picture you're painting. Maybe you guys have been in shipping for a few years, and it's, old hat. It's multi-generational families. the first major fuel transition since 1830, thinking 20, 30, 50 years at a time. One of the biggest industries in the world that nobody ever sees. But this is all quite shocking to me. Here's what I'm hearing. That some of the most productive single work sites in the planet are shipyards, owned by families who can make a decision like this to preserve decade-old futures. Because a lot of people worry about nuclear waste. It's going to last for decades. We're talking about families that have kept their shipping businesses going for more than a century.
Through wars.
Really bad wars for some of these countries.
Through bad world wars. Yeah.
Okay. And then you're saying that when you said convergence, where you take surprising things and push them together, ultra long-lived family businesses making giant tens of billions of dollar decisions really fast in a massive, nearly hidden global industry, subject to surprising constraints from the International Marine Organization. You have this spark moment that can change that critical part of the world economy.
There are multiple catalysts involved here, right? There are a number of things. It's not just the IMO, it's their own desire, their own impetus to do better, faster, cheaper, better, more efficient businesses. They're always under that pressure, right? The IMO taxation, global taxation on fuels, different port structures, incoming port taxation. It's very complicated.
And it's kind of coming, but you're arguing, and surely your company and your investors have seen, it's coming to a head now.
We have a solution. Right, it's all coming to a head. But we have a solution for this. We have new atomic that's non-pressurized. It's a very new type of structure. It can go into shore and up the rivers, into the harbors, and it can be done. We have the fuel structures to do it. We have the expertise. We can build ships in one place, and we can build the fuel cells in another, and then bring them together in a different.
So there's going to be four key interesting trends, right, to look out for. There's going to be propulsion, which is Core Power's kind of core business, which is going to be very transformative for the ocean environment. It's quiet and clean, and it's very efficient. It makes a lot of sense in lots of ways, but there are some very important regulatory challenges that need to be overcome.
Yes.
There's fuels production that we talked about already, alternative fuels production through shipyard manufactured plants, which actually could achieve the rate of deployment, the scale of deployment, and the costs needed to produce very, very large, globally relevant volumes of synthetic fuels. There's the opportunity for the shipyards. There's the opportunity to switch to alternative fuels, but then also there's an opportunity for these manufactured power plants. So there's four very important ways in which the marine sector is going to get involved. Now, the big challenge is the interaction between the IMO, which is the marine regulatory entity, and the nuclear regulatory entities. And there are some really interesting movements on that. I was at the IAEA Floating Nuclear Power Plant Symposium just a few weeks ago, which is the first of its kind that they've hosted at the IAEA. I was chairing the open session, and there is, already Russia, frankly, is building these things and intending to export them, and serializing production of these floating power plants that are going to be deployed around the world. These innovations also bring interesting new geopolitical challenges, regulatory challenges. But what I think governments around the world are realizing, and certainly the IAEA is realizing, is that the boat is leaving the harbor, the train is leaving the station.
Quite literally.
They need to actually.
No, you're not advocating nuclear trains yet here.
No, I'm not.
Nuclear boats leaving the harbor.
That's right, and I think that what the kind of policy and regulatory entities are realizing is that they're not fit for purpose to move fast enough and respond quickly enough to the commercial drivers that we're seeing not only in the shipping industry but also in the oil and gas industry.
No, I happen to be trained and qualified in British English, and Kirsty is very polite sounding when she says not fit for purpose. Let me translate. That's one of the harshest things you can say. It means that regulatory bodies who thought that they were in control of things are watching literal nuclear ships exit harbors and make a changed world, and are suddenly gasping and having to catch up or be totally left behind.
They really have to start moving.
That's right.
Very quickly. Do you agree with that?
No, absolutely. It's sort of embarrassing that we have to have this discussion where we're trying to prod our regulators into addressing this.
COP28. We can have these tough discussions.
It's something that we've taken very seriously at Core Power, to really bring together the IMO and to bring to the IAEA to sort of homogenize the language, for a better choice of words, but to make it so that they both understand each other's perspective and how it can be done. It's not an alien concept. It just has to float. It's okay. It's been done before. We've had nuclear ships. We've had nuclear floating power plant. We've had all this before. This has all been done. This is so historically
so Tony,
over.
If you were tapped to help set up the IMAEA, is that something you put on a port city and maybe New York Harbor or something? Like, where does this go?
You to pick it, Singapore, somewhere neutral. That's London. Yeah.
I have an idea. So in the marine sector, you have something called classification, okay, and that is essentially codes and standards that are defined for the way that something needs to be made. It defines the quality assurance, quality control, the performance requirements of the thing. That's called a class. It's like a classification system, and it only works if you have a product. It only works if you're making the same thing, and then the oversight, the regulatory oversight for the quality control and quality assurance for the production of those things, and then ultimately for a vessel. So you get a ship class, right? And that's like a design that's been approved by the IMO.
I've heard some of these phrases. Panamax, is that a ship
It's
class?
like product-based licensing, which is a dream for us in the nuclear sector. And what you have is the IMO says, yes, this design is approved. It's fit for purpose. It's gonna be safe and secure, and we can provide assurance and insurance.
Right.
It's a very old system.
Very old.
And then there's regulatory organizations that are located everywhere around the world, close to the supply chain, making these things, close to the production and operation of these things, that is charged with the oversight of the implementation of those codes and standards. Now, that's the system that we need for the nuclear sector. So there is a way in which we can actually bring the regulatory oversight that we need through this system that already exists in the marine sector. We're pretty excited about that.
Speaking of regulatory oversight, we've had some interesting stories in the last year. Again, outside of shipping looking in. You have the Panama Canal, which I didn't realize could have a drought.
Yep.
And then also the Suez Canal, which I didn't realize could have a wedge.
Right.
Where both of these key canals, one case threatened slightly reduced capacity, and the other case straight up blocked Suez Canal by a ship the size of this entire Pavilion. And tell me something. I talked to you a while ago, and you said something very interesting. I mentioned the speed issue.
Right.
Could you tell me what nuclear shipping has to offer when we're worried about loss of major global supply routes through the Suez Canal, which cuts around Africa,
Right.
and the Panama Canal, which cuts around South America?
Well, if you don't have to refuel, you can go faster. You don't have to go through canals.
So as you go faster, you burn fuel faster than you move faster. In other words, the fuel burn is even faster than the speed increase. So if you don't have to refuel,
Right.
you are now Panama Canal proof, or your Suez Canal blockage proof.
Theoretically, you don't have to go through any. You have to do the calculation in terms of how much time you have to cut off your voyage. But yeah, theoretically, you don't have to have any blocks.
Well, that changes things in terms
Yeah.
of like nuclear being reliable power.
even
that makes
without
reliable global.
Even without the going through the canals or anything else, the point-to-points, the bigger point-to-points, Australia to Japan or Australia to China, all those point-to-point ore carriers, back billions of tons of this stuff back and forth. Those point-to-points can be done easily, right? There's no blockage. You just feed up the cargoes. It's much more efficient. You have more transit. The shippers make more money. It's just a better structure.
So, question for you: I always see these ship speeds in knots.
Correct.
Can you turn that into like kilometers per hour or miles per hour? How fast can we get nuclear shipping?
A knot is like 1.1 or 1.2 miles per hour. One nautical mile per hour is like 1.1 or 1.2.
Tony, give us some speeds. How fast can nuclear boats go?
Yes, the bigger ones can go 25 to 30 knots, I suppose, for quite a while. They're big vessels, so it depends on
35 miles an hour?
Yeah. So where would they go?
That's cooking.
And by the way, now they have to, in order to reduce their fuel consumption, they have to go slow speeding. It's called eco speed. So we ran the numbers on nuclear versus others. You do a number of calculations. You do different types of fuels: high fuel, high sulfur fuel, low sulfur fuel, eco fuel, blended fuel, high octane fuel, low octane fuel.
Now these are all different
methane,
black sludges,
methanol,
right?
they're all, but they get lighter, right? So lighter to darker black sludges, and you look at different types of alternative fuels, whether it's methanol or ammonia or maybe hydrogen. They have to do the calculation of how much they cost to manufacture. Right? So when you look at the cost of manufacture for these synthetic fuels, it's very expensive. But nuclear fuel, you know exactly what it is when it's loaded. So you have a ship that's loaded for X number of years with a fixed cost fuel structure. There's nothing like it. That kind of asset-backed structure and financing is ideal. You have a fixed cost for the vessel, you have a fixed cost for the fuel over the life of the vessel. You can calculate exactly what your break-even points are within a day or two of cargo carriage.
So here we have Tony uniting the worlds, coming to nuclear, learning the marine, but when we hear him get excited about what nuclear would mean for shipping, we hear the
it's green, and they make their own water along the way. They don't have to stop for water. They have water makers.
Make their own water.
Yeah, of course, water makers. They do their own. Of course.
Yeah, we have a design for a multi-product platform in the EPRI study that I mentioned, which is it's a power plant, so it's a gigawatt power plant on a floating platform that can make power and fuels, so hydrogen-based fuels, and desalinate enough water each day to supply the entire city of Accra. So that
Accra, Ghana. So
Accra,
a capital city.
Ghana, yeah, and this is actually one of the items that we haven't yet touched on. I just want to quickly mention, which is that the opportunity to deploy these offshore shipyard manufactured fuels and power and water and protein production plants to the developing economies and really accelerate their industrialization through the delivery of clean energy much faster than terrestrial infrastructure would be able to, particularly nuclear terrestrial infrastructure that has to go through all of the IAEA milestones and so on. This could be a flagged vessel, so made in a country with mature made in a country with mature nuclear capability, regulatory capability, and then operated by a team from that country and licensed and overseen by a regulator from that country. So let's say it's made in Korea, operated by a Korean team, it's located off the coast of Ghana, or by the UAE, absolutely, and just piping in the energy services to that economy.
I think we're going to stop there and get some questions because it's kind of mind expanding. And I want to make sure that people get a chance to grill you, like, what are the downsides, right? But I'm going to hear from the audience. If anybody here has a question for Kirsty and Tony.
First, thank you for the excellent presentation, eye-opening, both of you. So when we're talking about synthetic fuel, we're talking hydrogen, ammonia. What are the synthetic fuels you're talking about? And you're talking about making these fuels on the offshore near the platform and then feeding it to is that what you're saying?
So we have designs for fuels production on these offshore platforms. Actually, it's a very interesting opportunity to have the chemical process facility located on the ship. So, and the fuels that we're talking about, we have in the EPRI study, we have a case study on ammonia production, and we also have one on synthetic hydrocarbons, which we would targeting aviation fuel for that. You obviously need a supply of carbon to make synthetic hydrocarbons, but there are many other kinds of fuels that you could make, like methanol, for example.
How about hydrogen?
Well, hydrogen is the feedstock for both of those fuels. So, but we don't see hydrogen playing a big role as an end-use fuel because it's difficult to store and transport, and you would require a lot of investment in new end-use infrastructure. What we're really interested in is providing drop-in substitutes. Reusing as much as possible existing end-use storage, distribution infrastructure, and actually leveraging the skills and the capabilities and the supply chains that already exist in the global economy, including in the oil and gas industry. So to convert the oil and gas industry from being, oil producers into clean fuel suppliers. That's the big vision.
Any other questions? Sure.
Yeah, I'll just add to the question about that. So, Kirsty was a very important point that we've spoken to. The majors are involved. The majors are asking questions now much more than they ever have been, the oil majors. So the oil field of the future, the offshore oil field of the future, is its own extraction, production, refinery, synthetic fuel creation machine. And it's powered by floating nuclear.
Now, we've heard of
because the extraction costs will be lower over time. They don't have to extract, bring back, refine, put back out. It's a whole different supply chain structure. very intelligent. It's happening.
Tony, we've heard you say the oil majors, they're the ones getting stick in the news over COP28. You're saying that maybe they'd get a little less stick if they...
So the interesting thing for the oil majors is that if they could cost effectively convert their existing fossil assets, like the Jebel Ali field here in UAE, for example, if you were to use electrified steam methane reforming powered by nuclear energy, that would be a radical difference in terms of the efficiency and the cost of steam methane reforming today, because you're not, and it would be emissions free. You could actually convert the existing oil fields without consuming any of the product into emissions-free ammonia and sell that on global markets at a thank you.
So in other words, you're saying you got your nuclear power, either electricity or heat, you use it to make hot steam, you crack apart the carbon fuel, the hydrocarbon, you take the hydro, fix it, and then that's your... Okay, just checking, just checking.
Doctor.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit more about the regulatory conditions? I'm just wondering, do the conditions for are the conditions for maritime use in place already? I know in the U.S. we have maritime vessels associated with the armed forces, but do we? And then I'm sorry. And then on top of that too, are we potentially limited if a few countries, their regulators approve it, but let's say there's a slow-moving act like the NRC where you're going to be able to maybe ship between certain nations, but they can't come into U.S. ports or something like that.
Right. So just today, the China State Shipping Company announced they're going to be making nuclear reactors for floating power and for commercial vessels. So to your point about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission being kicked in the butt about moving forward, they're going to have to address that very quickly. It's a national defense, national security, energy issue. So they're very competent people. They get it. They just have a prescribed structure in which they operate now. So we're trying to break a mold that hasn't been broken in a long time. But they understand it. They're very competent. They'll get it. Our path towards that really is through our government. I mean, as a commercial entity, we try not to do too much with the government if we can avoid it, but they're very positive on this, they're very helpful. So we believe the best way to go forward is through the DOE and the DOD to create an umbrella structure for years of sea trials. Because any vessel like this, whether classified or not, has to do sea trials of this kind of magnitude. It has to have kinetics, it has to be shot at, has to be sunk and capsized and turned over. And by the way, the Navy's done all of this. This is not new. This is old ground. So we will be getting the use of old ground, and as we move forward with our commercial venture of magnitude for the benefit of the United States and our allied partners, we will make sure that happens. It'll happen in time, but yeah.
So I just want to, because I'm sort of, that's a kind of great sort of, one commercial like approach, but actually there's a sort of world out there too that we see that regulators from countries that have existing mature nuclear regulatory capability, any of those countries could really start embarking on this opportunity, like Canada, Korea, Finland, Sweden, Japan, maybe the UK. And it may be that, the US is going to start moving much more quickly once it really starts to kind of internalize the reality that this is happening.
Kirsty, how about internalizing the reality of what Tony just said? We sort of buried the lead here. You're saying China today announced they're putting reactors similar to the ones you found to be the best way forward on ships starting now.
Yeah. And so there is really a kind of an urgency that we figure this out. Because it's already happening, and there are global implications for this. So we really need to be sort of particularly the nuclear weapon state countries need to be figuring out what the implications are for the kind of oversight that they would be subject to, and the non-nuclear weapon states also need to have a level playing field.
Wow, dark COP28. This is intense. Angelica.
Hi. As Tony mentioned, nuclear shipping is not a new idea. The U.S. have been doing this with navies and also the Russians, and all of those vessels have been powered with pressurized water reactors of one kind or another. But I understand Core Energy's chosen a molten cell technology, and also the Chinese efforts have converged on a molten salt technology. Can you speak a little bit about why this technology, and what are the implications if they're in the case of an accident? Salt is it not soluble, and what are the safety implications? And for Kirsty, I'd like to also hear your take on the technology.
And that means we've got the elevator pitch version, the version you practice to walk into the family firms. We've got 30 seconds each.
Yeah, so I'll defer much of the science to Kirsty, but we chose our partners and the technology for a few reasons. Right, so we're partnering with Southern Company and TerraPower. We, of course, like the management structure of both of those companies. We believe they've been at this for a very long time. They started at least 10 or 12 years ago. This is a very long cycle. So in terms of the product selection or the technology selection, we looked at 10 different types of reactor out there. We invested in one, didn't like it, divested. Then we invested in the TerraPower group with the Southern Company. And that's just a better long-term structure. And the optimum operating characteristics that we see in the molten chloride fast reactor are primarily non-pressurization. Right, it's a not pressurized structure. Its emergency planning zone is contained within the vessel of the ship, right, or the floating power plant. So it's inside the vessel. Ideally, is what it's supposed to work. Very long fuel cycle, so 30, 35 years. The testing they've done so far is that we know through the salt looping and how it works, they think it can be 30, 35 years fuel cycle and then be able to reuse the fuel. Right, the containment vessel may be the one that actually wears out before the fuel, which is kind of crazy from a finance perspective. It's almost ideal. You have an asset within an asset. Your ship is an asset, your fuel is an asset. That changes the dynamic of the whole utility payment structure. It's really very good. So management structure, I'll leave it at that. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so we love the molten salt. Go faster in bringing it to market, please. That's one thing I would say. So for these things to be deployed at the scale and speed that we're talking about globally, we need to have like a very different safety profile from light water reactors. Okay, they need to be passively safe. You want functional containment, to use a technical term, which means that you get these like little ceramic fuel pellets that just are indestructible, cannot melt down, and that means that you can put these things pretty much anywhere without, the risk of there being a radioactive release into the environment, which is going to be super important for the kind of public confidence and for the very, streamlined regulatory oversight that we need to make this commercially viable. The higher temperature advanced reactors, the high temperature gas reactors, the molten salt reactors, they're all awesome, and we'll see. The technologies are coming. Economics is key. Commercial viability is key in terms of large-scale deployment, and ultimately speed to market is going to make a really big difference, at least in the near term. And the conversations we're having with these very large commercial entities that I've been mentioning, they want something in the water before 2030. Okay, we're like by 2030, and they're like, well, 2028 would be nice.
All right, so there we've had it. The world runs on ships. The ships run on gelatinous, dark, nasty bunker fuel, and we're going to convert that to nuclear. And although it's a good idea, it's been needed for a long time. We've been having a lot of climate conferences talking about things, and we've needed this one. It sounds like the nuclear ships are starting to leave the harbor, meaning we get the oldest story in nuclear. We may decarbonize by accident because we have to get there because other people got there first. I'm okay with that. Whatever makes it a better world and makes us more prosperous and protect the environment, we'll take it for whatever the reason. Everybody, thank you so much to Kirsty and to Tony, and harass them with all your other questions afterwards.